The domestic quarters of Thornfield Manor possessed that particular quality of controlled chaos that characterized most English country houses, a realm wherein the servants maintained elaborate systems of hierarchy and resentment beneath surfaces polished to a mirror shine. Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, was a woman of perhaps 60 years, with the grey-haired, tight-lipped demeanor of someone who had devoted her entire existence to the proposition that discretion was not merely a virtue, but a sacred obligation. She received Whimsy in the housekeeper's room with the cautious formality of a woman being interviewed by someone she could not quite place within her established categories. "I am afraid I know very little about Mr. Ashford's private affairs, my lord," she began, which was precisely what everyone always said when they knew rather a great deal, and were determined to continue knowing it in silence. Whimsy, settling himself into a chair that squeaked in protest, affected an air of gentle inquiry rather than interrogation. "I don't imagine you do, Mrs. Hartley. Housekeepers are rather like naval officers. Everything transpires under their command, yet nothing is precisely their concern. But you did find him this morning, which must have been rather a shock." The woman's composure flickered marginally, suggesting that the shock had been genuine. "I brought his tea as I always do, sir. 7 o'clock precisely. He liked it strong, with just the smallest drop of milk. The door was closed but not locked, so I entered as I normally would, and there he was." She paused, and her hands, which had been folded in her lap with admirable composure, tightened slightly. "I knew at once he was gone. One does know these things, don't one?" Whimsy nodded with an understanding that he did not entirely feel, for his experience with death had taught him that people recognized it through various means, none of which were particularly reliable. "The cup," he said, allowing his voice to drift into what might have been mere conversational territory. "Was it empty when you found it?" Mrs. Hartley's expression suggested that she had been asked this question already, and had found it unsatisfactory. "Nearly so, sir. There was perhaps a tablespoon of liquid remaining. It was cold by then, naturally." He leaned forward with an air of conspiratorial interest. "Tell me, did Mr. Ashford have a particular routine for his evening? Did he always take tea in the study, or was this morning's arrangement unusual in any fashion?" The housekeeper considered this with the gravity of someone being asked to testify before a tribunal. "His evening routine was invariable, sir. Dinner at 7, then to his study by 8 o'clock. He would read until 9, occasionally 9:30, and then retire. But last evening was not entirely ordinary." Here, Whimsy's attention, which had been affecting a certain scattered quality, sharpened considerably. In what manner was it not ordinary? Mrs. Hartley seemed to be deliberating between her natural inclination toward discretion and her civic duty to assist in the investigation of sudden death. Civic duty apparently triumphed. "He had a visitor, sir. A woman. I didn't see her face clearly, but I heard her voice in the study as I was clearing the dinner things. She seemed agitated, sir. There were raised voices, though I couldn't make out the words. This intelligence," Whimsy reflected, altered the landscape considerably. A secret visitor was precisely the sort of detail that local constables dismissed in favor of more obvious narratives. Yet it was precisely the sort of detail that tended to matter in cases involving cyanide and midnight appointments. "When did this visitor arrive?" he inquired, maintaining his tone of idle interest. "At approximately 8:30, sir." "I heard the bell. She must have come through the front entrance. I was in the kitchen by then, but I heard Mrs. Pemberton, that's our cook, mentioning that a lady had arrived without warning." Whimsy rose and moved toward the window, a habit of his when thinking required a change of perspective. "And when did she depart?" There was a silence, which in itself was informative. "I'm not entirely certain, sir. I assumed she left some time before I retired. That was 10:30, but I didn't actually see her go. The study door was closed for the remainder of the evening." This was interesting, very interesting indeed. A woman arrives, voices are raised, the study door closes, and at some point between 8:30 and the following morning, Humphrey Ashford becomes deceased, his teacup tainted with cyanide. The constable's theory of a simple cardiac event became increasingly untenable. Did Mr. Ashford seem particularly troubled yesterday? Before the visitor arrived, I mean. Mrs. Hartley's shoulders rose in the slightest of shrugs. "Mr. Ashford always seemed troubled, sir, if you don't mind my saying so. He was not a cheerful gentleman. But yesterday he received several letters by post. One of them seemed to upset him considerably. He opened it, read it through twice, and then burned it in the fireplace without a word." Wimsey returned to his chair, his expression one of polite fascination. "And this letter, did you happen to notice from whom it came?" The housekeeper's loyalty to her employers warred visibly with her sense of obligation. "It bore a London postmark, sir, but I didn't see a return address. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive paper. That's all I can tell you." It was, Wimsey reflected, considerably more than most people would tell under similar circumstances, which suggested that Mrs. Hartley possessed either an uncommonly clear conscience or an uncommonly compelling reason to see the truth emerge. He thanked her with genuine courtesy and requested permission to interview the remaining household staff, a request that was granted with the weary resignation of someone who understood that the machinery of official investigation, once set in motion, was not easily halted. As he was leaving the housekeeper's room, Wimsey paused at the threshold. "One final question, if you would be so kind. Is there a garden door? Something that might permit a visitor to leave without passing through the main entrance?" Mrs. Hartley's expression suggested that this question had touched upon something she had been reluctant to mention. "There is a side entrance through the morning room, sir. It opens onto the rose garden. Mr. Ashford had the lock replaced only last week. The rose garden at Thornfield Manor, viewed in the pale December sunlight that filtered through clouds of the consistency of wet wool, possessed all the desolate charm of horticultural ambition abandoned to the approaching winter." Wimsey stood upon the flagstone path, examining the side door with the concentration one might afford to a particularly cryptic passage in a medieval manuscript. The lock, recently installed as Mrs. Hartley had indicated, was of good quality, a Chubb mechanism that would have presented no impediment to someone possessed of both skill and determination. The ground surrounding the door bore the confused imprints of various footsteps, rendered largely indecipherable by the depredations of morning frost and the investigative wanderings of Constable Fellows. What was more interesting, however, was the absence of a particular sort of mark. There were no signs of forced entry, no scratches about the mechanism, no indication that anyone had stood at this door in the darkness attempting to effect an entrance. This suggested, rather strongly, that whoever had departed through this exit had possessed a key, or else had left by daylight, when the absence of a departing figure would have attracted less attention. Wimsey knelt beside the door, his trouser knees acquiring a fine patina of frost crystals, and examined the threshold with the intensity of a man deciphering an obscure text. There, caught upon the brass trim of the door frame, was a single strand of material, scarlet, expensive, and bearing all the hallmarks of having been recently torn from some garment of considerable cost. He pocketed the strand carefully and turned his attention to the rose garden proper. December was not the season for roses, naturally, but the skeletal remains of the plants that had once flourished in this garden bore testimony to thorough cultivation and generous feeding. Wimsey's knowledge of horticulture was adequate, though not passionate, but he recognized that whoever maintained these roses maintained them with obsessive care. The soil had been turned recently, enriched with what appeared to be fresh mulch, and the pruning had been done with a precision that suggested either genuine love or elaborate neuroticism. In his experience, the distinction was often negligible. He was kneeling beside a particularly robust specimen when he heard footsteps upon the gravel path behind him. Rising with practiced ease, he turned to face a man of perhaps 55, dressed in the practical tweeds of a country gentleman and possessing the weathered complexion of someone who spent considerable time outdoors, despite the protestations of English winter. "You must be Lord Peter Wimsey," the man said, his voice carrying the particle. AR inflection of educated confidence. "I'm Charles Ashford, Humphrey's cousin. The local police mentioned you'd been called in." Wimsey brushed frost from his trousers with the air of a man who had just been caught in an undignified position, and was determined not to appear embarrassed by it. "Indeed. Frightfully kind of the constabulary to include me in their deliberations. I was merely admiring your cousin's roses. They're quite remarkable for this time of year." Charles Ashford's expression suggested a man attempting to navigate a conversation conducted partially in a foreign language. Yes, well, Humphrey was rather obsessed with them. Spent an absolute fortune on fertilizers and special treatments. Between you and me, I always thought it rather odd. A man his age fussing about with flowers like some sort of antiquarian gardener. But then, Humphrey was always peculiar. Wimsey filed this observation away for later consideration and turned the conversation toward more immediately relevant territory. "Tell me, Mr. Ashford, are you aware of any female visitors who called upon your cousin recently? A woman, perhaps, who visited last evening?" Charles Ashford's demeanor shifted subtly, acquiring a tension that suggested either genuine ignorance or elaborate performance. "A woman? Can't say I know anything about that. I only arrived this morning, actually. Got a telephone call from Mrs. Hartley telling me that Humphrey was dead. Drove up from London straight away." This was verifiable, Wimsey supposed, and probably true. "And your cousin? Did he mention to you during any recent correspondence that he was expecting a visitor? Anyone from his past, perhaps? An old acquaintance?" The cousin shook his head with what appeared to be genuine bewilderment. "Humphrey wasn't the sort to confide in relatives, Lord Peter. We exchanged perhaps 3 letters a year, mostly concerning the reading of his will and various bits of family business. He was a solitary man, rather withdrawn. I can't imagine who would have been calling upon him." Wimsey accepted this testimony with a nod that suggested neither belief nor disbelief, merely acknowledgement. "The will, then. Are you aware of its contents? Who inherits the estate?" Charles Ashford's face darkened slightly, acquiring that particular flush that suggested either anger or embarrassment. "That's hardly relevant to Humphrey's death, is it? The solicitor has the document, and it will be read in proper time. But if you must know, the bulk of the estate comes to me, as the nearest male heir. There are a few bequests to servants and some charitable organizations. Humphrey was peculiarly generous in that regard. But yes, I am the primary beneficiary." This was, Wimsey reflected, a motive of sorts, though of the rather obvious variety that he had learned to treat with considerable skepticism. The most straightforward motives were often the least reliable, concealing beneath their surface plausibility a far more complex web of resentment, passion, and psychological necessity. And this wouldn't trouble you particularly. Inheriting your cousin's estate? Charles Ashford's response was swift and slightly defensive. "Of course not. Humphrey was a wealthy man, but we weren't intimate. It's a straightforward matter of family inheritance. Besides, I have no financial difficulties. I'm comfortably situated in London with a respectable income." Wimsey smiled with the particular charm that invariably made suspects either extremely forthcoming or extremely guarded. "How reassuring. Then you won't mind if I verify your movements yesterday evening? A simple formality, you understand. The police do so enjoy having everything arranged in orderly fashion." The expression that crossed Charles Ashford's face suggested that he understood precisely what was being implied, and that this understanding was not particularly welcome. Charles Ashford's alibi, when eventually extracted from him with the reluctance of a man surrendering classified intelligence, proved to be of the sort that was simultaneously verifiable and entirely inadequate. He had dined at his London club on the previous evening, the Athenaeum, that most respectable of institutions, and had remained there until approximately 10 o'clock, at which point he had returned to his hotel, the Savoy, where he maintained a suite. These facts could be confirmed, he assured Wimsey with evident relief, by any number of waiters, porters, and hotel staff. However, as Wimsey observed with the gentlest of ironies, the London to Thornfield journey by motor car required approximately 90 minutes in favorable conditions, which meant that Charles Ashford could have easily departed London at 8:30, arrived at Thornfield by 10 o'clock, and returned to his hotel by midnight, all while appearing to maintain his alibi through the simple expedient of having dinner companions who would not necessarily notice his absence if he chose to slip away during the hours between 8 and 9. Charles Ashford's face acquired a shade of crimson that suggested either genuine indignation or carefully constructed performance. That's an absolutely outrageous suggestion, Lord Peter. I've no reason whatsoever to harm my cousin, and you've no evidence that I did. Wimsey conceded the point with a gracious inclination of his head. Quite right. I've merely established that your alibi, while superficially convincing, is not watertight. A considerable difference, you'll appreciate. He then excused himself from further conversation with the cousin and returned to the house, leaving Charles Ashford standing alone in the rose garden with an expression suggesting a man whose morning had taken decidedly unpleasant turns. Within the study, Wimsey devoted himself to a more thorough examination of Humphrey Ashford's papers, a task that proved both tedious and illuminating in equal measure. The letter that Mrs. Hartley had mentioned, the one Ashford had burned upon receiving, had left traces sufficient for investigation. By carefully sifting through the ashes in the fireplace and reconstructing fragments with the patience of an archaeologist, Wimsey recovered several words of significance. Cannot continue. The truth must emerge, and most tellingly, Thursday evening. The handwriting, what remained of it, suggested a female hand, educated and controlled despite the emotional turbulence implied by the content. The envelope fragments bore that same cream-colored expensive paper, and the postmark indicated a London origin from the previous day. Somewhere in that city was a woman sufficiently distressed by her relationship with Humphrey Ashford to write a letter of such apparent urgency, and sufficiently determined to visit him in person to effect an entrance that evening. Whether she had also been sufficiently motivated to administer cyanide to his teacup remained an open question, though the tenor of her letter suggested an individual capable of considerable emotional volatility. Wimsey's examination of Ashford's correspondence revealed a pattern of careful, methodical life lived largely in isolation. There were subscription notices from various libraries and learned societies, bills from London tailors and wine merchants, and a substantial volume of communication with his solicitor, Mr. Edmund Parkhouse, concerning the disposition of his estate and various business matters. What was conspicuously absent, however, was any personal correspondence of an intimate nature. No love letters, no passionate missives, no communication suggesting that Humphrey Ashford had maintained relationships of deep emotional significance with anyone. Yet the burned letter suggested otherwise. It suggested a person, a woman, who had occupied sufficient space in Ashford's life to warrant a secret evening visit, and whose emotional state regarding that relationship was considerably more turbulent than Ashford's apparent detachment would have suggested. This discrepancy interested Wimsey greatly, for in his experience, such discrepancies often concealed the precise mechanisms by which ordinary people arrived at extraordinary crimes. The photograph, however, was what truly illuminated the nature of Wimsey's investigation. It was discovered quite by accident while examining the contents of Ashford's desk, a small silver-framed portrait that had been deliberately concealed beneath a false bottom in the desk drawer. The photograph depicted a woman of perhaps 30 years, possessed of striking beauty of a rather unconventional sort, dark hair arranged in an elaborate style, eyes that suggested both intelligence and considerable emotional depth, and an expression that conveyed something between defiance and despair. The photograph itself was expensive, clearly the work of a skilled London photographer, and bore upon its reverse the words to H, who alone understands. Forever, M. The initial M, combined with the abandoned desperation evident in the handwriting, suggested a name and nothing more. But it was a beginning. Wimsey carefully extracted the photograph and slipped it into his jacket pocket, returning the false-bottom drawer to its original appearance with the precision of a man who understood the value of allowing suspects to remain unaware of what he had discovered. By the time Wimsey returned to the morning room where Inspector Graves had established his makeshift headquarters, the coroner's preliminary analysis had confirmed W. Hat the almond scent and the presence of cyanide traces suggested, Humphrey Ashford had been poisoned with approximately 15 grains of potassium cyanide, sufficient to ensure death within minutes of ingestion. The poison had been administered in his teacup, likely dissolved in whatever remnants of liquid had remained from an earlier beverage. This indicated premeditation and knowledge of Ashford's evening routine, precisely the sort of intimate knowledge that a secret visitor might possess. Inspector Graves, who possessed the earnest demeanor of a policeman confronting a case of genuine complexity, seemed relieved to have Whimsy's presence as a counterbalance to the increasing intricacy of the investigation. "It appears to be murder, then, my lord," Graves observed with the air of announcing something revolutionary, "though I confess I'm at something of a loss regarding motive and opportunity. Charles Ashford seems the obvious suspect, but his alibi is more or less sound, and there's no evidence connecting him to any woman visitor." Whimsy settled into a chair and lit a cigarette with the deliberation of a man preparing to deliver observations of some significance. "Indeed, Inspector. Yet the question of who visited Mr. Ashford yesterday evening remains the paramount mystery. Without establishing the identity of this woman, we are left merely with speculation and supposition. I believe, therefore, that we must make inquiries in London. The letter, the photograph, the desperate tone of the correspondence, all point toward a woman whose connection to Humphrey Ashford involved considerably more than casual acquaintance. The journey to London was undertaken in Whimsy's motor car, a vehicle of considerable elegance and sufficient horsepower to cover the distance in approximately 2 hours, provided one maintained a velocity that would have alarmed most contemporary drive. And terrified at least half of them. Inspector Graves had been persuaded to remain at Thornfield, ostensibly to continue questioning the household staff, but in reality, because Whimsy had gently suggested that the presence of official police authority might inhibit certain inquiries of a delicate nature. The photograph of the mysterious M had been entrusted to Graves with careful instructions that it was to be shown to none of the suspects, a provision that had occasioned some visible bewilderment, but which Whimsy had declined to elaborate upon. As the motor car consumed the miles between the countryside and the metropolis, Whimsy devoted himself to the construction of various hypotheses regarding the identity and motivations of the woman in the photograph. The initial M suggested Margaret, Mary, or Millicent. Common enough names that scarcely narrowed the field, but the photograph itself suggested a woman of considerable social standing, educated, and possessed of resources sufficient to afford the services of a fashionable photographer. Such a woman would have left traces, acquaintances, records of her existence that might be discovered through judicious inquiry. His first destination was the offices of Edmund Parkhouse, solicitor, located in that warren of legal establishments clustered about Lincoln's Inn Fields. Parkhouse himself was a man of perhaps 65 years, with the cautious demeanor of someone who had devoted his entire professional existence to the proposition that indiscretion was invariably punished. Whimsy presented himself without pretense, stating his interest in the investigation of Humphrey Ashford's death and requesting whatever information Parkhouse might be willing to divulge regarding his client's personal affairs. The solicitor's initial response was predictable: client confidentiality, obligations of discretion, the sanctity of professiona. Relationship, but Whimsy possessed the particular charm and authority that occasionally induced even the most circumspect of professional men to reconsider their adherence to absolute confidentiality. "I should perhaps mention," Whimsy observed conversationally, "that Mr. Ashford is now deceased, and that the question of his death appears to involve circumstances of a rather intimate nature. The woman he was meeting with last evening has not been identified, and in the absence of such identification, I fear the innocent may be implicated in what appears to be a crime of passion rather than premeditation." Parkhouse's resolve wavered perceptibly. He rose from behind his desk and moved to the window, presenting his back to Whimsy with the air of a man requiring a moment of contemplation. "I can tell you very little, Lord Peter. Mr. Ashford's affairs were, as you suggest, of a rather personal nature, matters he clearly did not wish to broadcast. However, I can confirm that approximately 6 months ago he altered his will significantly. The bulk of his estate, which had previously been intended to pass to his cousin Charles, was instead to be held in trust, with the income to be provided to a particular individual." Whimsy felt the stirrings of genuine interest, and this particular individual, was this individual's name perhaps beginning with the letter M? Parkhouse's expression suggested considerable surprise at this prescience. "How could you possibly—" "Yes, actually, Margaret Ashford. Though she was not born to that name, She is, or rather was, Margaret Torrance, the daughter of a respected but now deceased family friend. This revelation opened avenues of inquiry that had previously remained opaque. A woman bearing the Ashford surname, yet unknown to Charles Ashford, suggested either a very recent marriage or a relationship of a nature that had been deliberately allied from the family. Whimsy extracted from the increasingly cooperative solicitor the address of a London townhouse that had been purchased by Ashford some 8 months previously, established in Margaret's name and maintained at considerable expense. The arrangement suggested not merely a romantic entanglement, but something more substantial, a deliberate provision for the woman's future, a commitment of resources that implied either genuine affection or some obligation of considerable moral weight. Upon departing Parkhouse's office, Whimsy directed his motorcar toward Kensington, where the townhouse in question was situated on a quiet street lined with similar Victorian constructions, each possessed of that particular air of expensive discretion that London afforded to those who valued privacy above ostentation. The townhouse appeared unoccupied, its windows dark despite the afternoon hour, its curtains drawn with a thoroughness that suggested an absence of some duration. However, the door was answered, after considerable delay, by a woman of perhaps 40 years, possessed of the rigid posture and guarded expression of someone engaged in the protection of secrets. Whimsy's identity and his explanation of his purpose produced a visible conflict within her, obligation to her absent employer warring with civic duty and curiosity regarding the circumstances of Humphrey Ashford's death. "Mrs. Ashford is not in residence," the woman finally offered, which was both true and extraordinarily uninformative. "When did she last depart from this house?" Whimsy inquired with gentle persistence. "That would be yesterday evening, sir. She left at approximately 8:30, and instructed me to ensure that the house was closed and locked should she not return by morning. She said she was meeting someone, and that the matter was of considerable importance." The woman's face acquired a troubled expression. "I have been concerned, sir." She took a small bag with her, and she seemed rather distressed. "It's not like her to be away without informing me of her expected return." Whimsy's mind was rapidly reconstructing a timeline that acquired increasingly sinister implications. Margaret Ashford, the mysterious woman who had visited her relative, or former relative, on the previous evening, had departed the townhouse at 8:30, ostensibly to meet someone of considerable importance. The timing aligned precisely with the burned letter, the reference to Thursday evening, and the desperate tone of her correspondence. But where was Margaret Ashford now, and more pressingly, had she been present at Thornfield Manor when the cyanide had been administered to Humphrey Ashford's teacup? The investigation into Margaret Ashford's movements on the previous evening proved to be an exercise in the reconstruction of fragments, each piece of information acquired through patient inquiry and the subtle deployment of authority that Whimsy had cultivated over years of amateur detection. The railway stations yielded the first confirmations. A woman matching Margaret's description had purchased a ticket to Thornfield at Victoria Station at 7:15, arriving at the village station at approximately 8:50. This timing aligned remarkably well with the account provided by Mrs. Hartley, suggesting that Margaret had indeed travelled to the estate with deliberate intention and careful planning. From the station, the trail became more obscure. A taxi driver recalled conveying a woman of dark hair and elegant bearing to Thornfield Manor, depositing her at the gates rather than proceeding to the main entrance, a precaution that suggested awareness of the necessity for discretion. The driver recalled her requesting that he wait, and that approximately 40 minutes later, she had emerged from the estate and requested return passage to the station, departing at approximately 9:40. This timeline created an unexpected complication for Whimsy's nascent hypothesis regarding Margaret's culpability. If she had truly administered the poison, she would have required considerably more time to ensure its effectiveness, or at the very least to observe her victim's demise. A 40-minute visit seemed inadequate for such purposes, suggesting either remarkable efficiency or a different explanation entirely for Margaret's visit to Thornfield Manor. The return journey to the townhouse in Kensington was undertaken with considerable urgency, for Wimsey had begun to suspect that the investigation was proceeding along a path that conventional logic might not adequately illuminate. Upon arrival, he found the servant woman, Mrs. Dennison, in a state of anxious agitation. A telegram had arrived approximately an hour previously, sent from Manchester, and containing only the cryptic message, "Cannot return. Circumstances require absence. Destroy letters as instructed. Trust no one." The telegram bore Margaret's signature, yet the content suggested a woman operating under considerable emotional duress, or, more disturbingly, a woman aware that suspicion might fall upon her, and taking precautions against such scrutiny. Wimsey requested permission to examine Margaret's personal effects, a request that Mrs. Dennison initially resisted, but ultimately granted when Wimsey suggested that cooperation was considerably preferable to the alternative of police search warrants and official investigation. The bedroom upstairs yielded little of immediate significance. Clothing of excellent quality, a modest collection of jewelry, and a library of books that suggested a woman of considerable intellectual sophistication and emotional depth. However, in a locked drawer beneath the bed, Wimsey discovered correspondence that illuminated aspects of the situation previously obscured. The letters were from Humphrey Ashford himself, and they traced the development of a relationship that was considerably more complex than a mere romantic entanglement. Margaret, it appeared, was not merely a woman to whom Ashford had attached himself in the manner of an aging man acquiring a younger companion. Rather, she was the illegitimate daughter of a woman with whom Ashford had maintained a long-standing relationship in his youth. A relationship that had produced a child he had refused to acknowledge and a woman he had subsequently abandoned to comparative poverty and hardship. The letters, written over the course of 6 months, represented Ashford's belated attempt at restitution, an acknowledgement of paternity that had never been made public, and an effort to provide for the daughter he had never recognized. Margaret's responses, preserved among the correspondence, revealed a woman torn between the desire for acknowledgement and the anger born of decades of abandonment and social stigma. The most recent letter, dated approximately 1 week previously, contained Ashford's proposal for a final meeting, a reconciliation of sorts, where he intended to introduce Margaret to his solicitor and ensure that her inheritance was secured beyond any possibility of legal challenge or familial dispute. This revelation fundamentally altered the landscape of Wimsey's investigation. Margaret Ashford possessed a motive of extraordinary potency. She was the illegitimate daughter of a man who had denied her existence for 30 years, suddenly offering her wealth and recognition. Yet she also possessed something that appeared to contradict such motivation, a desperate desire for paternal acknowledgement, that cyanide in a teacup would have permanently precluded. The burning question became not whether Margaret had administered the poison, the timeline made that increasingly unlikely, but rather who had possessed knowledge of her relationship to Humphrey Ashford and the inheritance implications that such knowledge carried. Charles Ashford, the cousin, would have become aware upon the reading of the will that his inheritance had been substantially reduced. Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, had witnessed the visitor and heard raised voices. And there remained the question of the scarlet fabric caught upon the door frame, a detail that had not yet been satisfactorily explained. Wimsey summoned a taxi and returned to Scotland Yard, where his acquaintance with various officials of the Metropolitan Police permitted him access to resources ordinarily denied to private investigators. Through their assistance, he was able to establish that a woman matching Margaret's description had boarded a train to Manchester on the previous evening at approximately 10:15, departing from Euston Station with a single piece of luggage. Further inquiry revealed that she had checked into a modest hotel under an assumed name, paying in advance and requesting absolute privacy. She remained in residence according to the hotel proprietor, though she had barely left her room and appeared to be in a state of considerable distress. The piece of scarlet fabric, when examined more closely by Wimsey and compared to samples from Margaret's wardrobe, proved to be from an evening cloak of expensive construction, a cloak that remained among her possessions in the Kensington townhouse, bearing a small tear consistent with the material discovered at Thornfield Manor. Margaret Ashford had been present at the estate, had departed through the side door, and had fled to Manchester in the manner of someone convinced of her own guilt, yet the evidence suggested that her conviction of guilt was company, considerably more complicated than a simple administration of poison. The hotel in Manchester, when finally located through the patient inquiries of local constabulary coordinated through Wimsey's contacts, proved to be of that particular species of establishment that catered to individuals requiring anonymity and discretion above comfort or elegance. Margaret Ashford occupied a small room on the second floor, and she answered Wimsey's knock with the wariness of a woman who had been expecting either police or considerably worse. She was indeed the woman in the photograph, though the intervening hours since her departure from Thornfield Manor appeared to have aged her considerably. Her face was drawn, her eyes possessed of that particular hollow quality that suggested sleeplessness measured in more than one night, and her hands trembled with a constancy that suggested either profound fear or the aftermath of considerable emotional upheaval. Wimsey entered without invitation, a privilege that his manner and apparent authority seemed to render unquestionable, and settled himself in the room's sole chair with the air of a man preparing for a lengthy conversation. "Miss Ashford," he began, employing the surname without the prefix of marriage that her father's will would have granted her, "I require an explanation regarding your presence at Thornfield Manor on the evening of your father's death, and more importantly, I require the truth regarding what transpired during your visit." Margaret's response was not defiance, but rather a collapse of whatever emotional fortifications she had constructed over the preceding day. She sank onto the bed, her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking with the violence of sobbing that appeared to contain elements of both grief and hysteria. "I didn't do it," she gasped between incoherent utterances. "I swear before God I didn't. I arrive." Ed at Thornfield with the intention of finally confronting him, of demanding recognition and acknowledgement of what he had done to my mother. But when I saw him... She paused, struggling to regain coherence. "When I saw him, I couldn't maintain my anger. He was old, Lord Peter. He was pathetic and alone, and he wept when he saw me. He actually wept." What emerged from Margaret's account was a narrative considerably more psychologically intricate than Wimsey's preliminary hypothesis had accommodated. She had indeed travelled to Thornfield with rage burning in her heart, rage accumulated over 3 decades of abandonment and social stigma. She had intended to confront Humphrey Ashford with the devastation her mother had endured, the poverty and shame that his refusal of acknowledgement had imposed. However, upon arrival and confrontation, she had discovered a man whom age and isolation had rendered peculiarly vulnerable, a man who appeared to be experiencing genuine remorse for the wrongs he had committed. The raised voices that Mrs. Hartley had overheard had been Ashford's attempts to explain, to apologize, and Margaret's initial resistance to such contrition. However, as the conversation had progressed, Margaret had gradually perceived the genuine nature of her father's distress and the authenticity of his desire for reconciliation. By the conclusion of their meeting, she had softened sufficiently to accept his invitation to take tea together, to sit and speak as father and daughter for the first time in her life. It was during this moment of tentative reconciliation that the tragedy had occurred. Ashford had poured the tea, had taken a single sip, and had almost immediately begun to display symptoms of acute distress. His face had flushed, his breathing had become labored, and within moments he had collapsed. Margaret, perceiving that something catastrophic had occurred, had abandoned caution and fled, convinced that she would be implicated in his death, and aware that her presence at the estate would make her the obvious suspect. This narrative placed Wimsey in a peculiar position of having to reconcile Margaret's testimony with the physical evidence he had already gathered. If Margaret's account was accurate, and her distress appeared far too genuine to be performance, then Humphrey Ashford had been poisoned not by his unexpected daughter, but by someone else entirely. The mechanism of poisoning became the crucial question. Margaret had not prepared the tea, Ashford had done so himself. This suggested that either the poison had been administered to the teapot itself prior to Margaret's arrival, or that someone else had been present and had added the poison to Ashford's cup during the brief moments when the two of them were engaged in conversation. The second possibility seemed marginally more plausible, which raised the question of who possessed access to the study and the knowledge that an opportunity for such administration would present itself. Wimsey rose from his chair and stood at the window, gazing out at the Manchester street below with an expression suggesting profound concentration. "Tell me," he said without turning from the window, "when you departed from the study, did you notice anything unusual? Any person lurking about the corridors? Any sign that you had been observed?" Margaret struggled to recall details that panic and emotional trauma had rendered obscure. "There was a woman in the hallway," she finally offered hesitantly. "I didn't see her clearly because I was hurrying and rather distressed, but I heard her voice. She was speaking to someone, a man, I think. The moment I saw them, I slipped out through the side door. I didn't want to be seen, you understand." Wimsey's expression acquired a quality of intense interest. "Saint this woman. Describe her if you can. Age, appearance, anything distinctive." Margaret closed her eyes, attempting to resurrect details from memory rendered hazy by trauma and the passage of hours. She was wearing a scarlet cloak. I remember that quite clearly. Dark hair, I think, though it was difficult to see, and her voice was familiar somehow. I had heard it before, though I couldn't place where. Wimsey felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to arrange themselves into a configuration that was considerably more disturbing than he had initially envisioned. A woman in a scarlet cloak, familiar enough to Margaret to evoke recognition, present at Thornfield Manor at the precise moment when Humphrey Ashford had consumed poisoned tea. The implications suggested a betrayal of a particularly intimate variety, and Wimsey understood that the investigation had entered territory where conventional logic required supplementation by psychological penetration of a considerably more subtle nature. The return to Thornfield Manor was undertaken with the conviction that the investigation had been proceeding along a fundamentally erroneous path, and that the true perpetrator of Humphrey Ashford's murder remained unsuspected among the household and its associates. Wimsey's motorcar consumed the distance between Manchester and the countryside with characteristic velocity, arriving at the estate as the afternoon light was acquiring that particular golden quality that preceded the December twilight. Inspector Graves was discovered in the study, reviewing his notes with the expression of a man confronting the increasing complexity of his case, and Wimsey's arrival appeared to occasion considerable relief. "I believe," Wimsey announced without preamble, "that we have been examining this case from an incorrect angle of approach. The crucial question is not who had motive to murder Humphrey Ashford, but rather who possessed knowledge of both his relationship with Margaret and the specific circumstances of her visit on the evening of his death." Graves's expression suggested bewilderment tempered with the hope that Wimsey's characteristic obliquity might yet yield illumination. "Are you suggesting that someone was present at the manor during the visit, Lord Peter? Someone who observed the reunion between father and daughter?" "Precisely so," Wimsey confirmed, moving toward the window and gazing out at the rose garden with an intensity that seemed to extend beyond mere horticultural appreciation. "Someone who understood that Humphrey Ashford's sudden recognition of his illegitimate daughter represented a threat to established arrangements and anticipated inheritances. Someone who possessed access to the household, knowledge of Ashford's movements, and sufficient familiarity with poisons to select a substance and quantity that would produce death with remarkable speed and certainty." Graves leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You're not suggesting Charles Ashford, surely? We've established his movements with reasonable certainty, and there's no indication he was aware of Margaret's existence until after his cousin's death." "Charles Ashford," Wimsey agreed, "is guilty primarily of avarice and familial indifference. Serious moral deficiencies, perhaps, but not capital crimes. However, there remains the question of the servant woman, the individual who maintained the household and possessed intimate knowledge of Ashford's routines and habits. I refer, naturally, to Mrs. Hartley." Graves's expression suggested that this conclusion had not occurred to him as a possibility. "Mrs. Hartley? Surely not, Lord Peter. She's been in service at Thornfield for nearly 20 years. Why would she suddenly murder her employer?" Wimsey turned from the window, his expression acquiring that particular quality of ironic amusement that invariably preceded his most incisive observations. "That is precisely the question that requires answering. Mrs. Hartley, I would hypothesize, possessed far more than a mere domestic relationship with Humphrey Ashford. Consider the evidence. She maintained his household with obsessive precision. She anticipated his requirements before they were expressed, and, most tellingly, she appeared to harbor a protective attitude toward his affairs that transcended the ordinary bounds of professional duty. I suggest that Mrs. Hartley was significantly more than a housekeeper. I suggest she was Humphrey Ashford's mistress, the woman with whom he had shared intimate companionship for many years, and the woman who stood to lose the most profound security when the prospect of marriage or formal recognition of another woman entered his life. This hypothesis appeared to strike Graves with the force of revelation, but that would suggest that she felt threatened by Miss Margaret's appearance, that she viewed the daughter as a rival, not merely a legal complication. Precisely, Wimsey confirmed with evident satisfaction. And that brings us to the question of means and opportunity. I believe that Mrs. Hartley was aware of Margaret's existence prior to the evening of her visit. I believe further that Humphrey Ashford, in his capacity as a man attempting to rectify past wrongs, had confessed the circumstances of his illegitimate daughter to his long-standing companion. Mrs. Hartley, perceiving herself to be abandoned or superseded by a younger woman, or worse, by the prospect of Ashford's conscience compelling him toward formal recognition and marriage, determined to prevent such an outcome through the administration of poison. Graves rose from his chair, his expression acquiring the troubled quality of a man confronting uncomfortable truths. "You're suggesting premeditation of a particularly calculated variety, Lord Peter. That Mrs. Hartley poisoned her lover to prevent what she perceived as abandonment?" "Not precisely abandonment," Wimsey corrected, "but rather a transformation of their relationship from one based upon secrecy and mutual dependence into something more formal and publicly acknowledged. Mrs. Hartley, I suspect, had constructed her entire identity around her position in Ashford's household. She was not merely his servant, she was the woman who alone understood him, who provided both domestic comfort and intimate companionship, who existed in that peculiar twilight between servant and mistress. The prospect of Margaret's recognition and incorporation into that relationship threatened the fundamental structure of her existence. Wimsey moved toward the bell-pull and directed Graves to summon Mrs. Hartley to the study. The housekeeper's arrival was marked by a composure that appeared only marginally ruffled by this summons. She possessed the bearing of a woman accustomed to obeying authority and disinclined to display emotional vulnerability before her superiors. Yet Wimsey observed a minute tremor in her hands as she stood before them. The slight tightening of her jaws, he began to speak. "Mrs. Hartley," he commenced with gentle courtesy, "I wonder if you would be willing to tell Inspector Graves the true nature of your relationship with Humphrey Ashford. Not the relationship of employer and employee that appears in the household accounts, but rather the more intimate arrangement that existed between you for what I would estimate to be approximately 15 years. The housekeeper's face acquired a pallor that suggested the ground beneath her feet had suddenly become uncertain. She opened her mouth as if to deny the accusation, then closed it again, recognizing the futility of such denial. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "He said he would provide for me," she said, her words seeming to emerge from depths of accumulated pain and resentment. "He promised that I would never be abandoned, that our arrangement would continue until the end of our lives. He swore it." The confession that emerged from Mrs. Hartley over the course of the subsequent hours was rendered in a tone of profound bitterness, tempered only marginally by the recognition of her own culpability in the crime she was committing. She had indeed served as Humphrey Ashford's mistress for the better part of 15 years, a relationship that had begun when she was younger and possessed of illusions regarding the permanence of such arrangements. Ashford had been generous in material terms. Her wages had been substantial. She had been provided with her own quarters and absolute privacy within the household, and she had occupied a position of authority within the domestic sphere that was unusual for a woman of her station. However, the relationship had always been conducted in darkness, hidden behind the facade of a strictly professional association, never acknowledged in public and subject to the absolute discretion that professional reputation demanded. Over the years, Mrs. Hartley had constructed an existence around this peculiar domestic arrangement, finding in it sufficient security and companionship to offset the social stigma and emotional complexity that such a relationship entailed. She had come to view Thornfield Manor not as the household of an employer, but as her own domain, a kingdom wherein she exercised genuine authority and held genuine power. The arrival of Humphrey Ashford's letter regarding his illegitimate daughter had threatened the very foundation upon which she had constructed her life. He said he wanted to make things right, Mrs. Hartley explained, her voice acquiring the flatness of someone recounting events stripped of their emotional context through repeated internal rehearsal. He said that he had wronged this woman, Margaret, and that he owed her recognition and financial provision. He asked me if I understood, if I could accept the changes that would be necessary, as if I had any choice in the matter. She paused, her hands gripping the edge of the chair with sufficient force to blanch her knuckles. I told him that I would accept whatever arrangements he deemed necessary. I lied, of course. I had no intention of accepting anything of the sort. The prospect of this girl appearing at Thornfield, of becoming the acknowledged heir, of replacing me in his life, it was intolerable. It was betrayal of the most fundamental variety. Whimsy observed the progression of her narrative with the detachment of a man recording testimony that he had already anticipated with considerable accuracy. And so you determined to prevent such an occurrence through the administration of poison. But the question becomes, Mrs. Hartley, how did you manage to effect the poisoning without implicating yourself? Humphrey Ashford prepared the tea himself, in the presence of his daughter. You could not have introduced cyanide without her observation unless— He paused, allowing the implication to resolve itself within the spaces of her own consciousness. Unless you had already administered the poison to the teapot itself, prior to his visit from London. Mrs. Hartley's expression suggested that she recognized the net had been drawn sufficiently tight that further dissimulation was merely the performance of futility. I obtained the cyanide from the gardening supplies, she admitted, her voice barely audible. We have always maintained a supply for the treatment of rose diseases. Humphrey would never have thought to question its presence. He knew nothing of such practical matters. I dissolved it in a small quantity of water and poured it into the teapot on the afternoon of his death. I knew he would prepare tea for himself in the evening. He always did. I thought perhaps he would die in his sleep, peacefully, and that the matter would be concluded without drama or investigation. She looked up at Whimsy with eyes that contained within them the accumulated weight of years of suppressed emotion and psychological distortion. I did not anticipate that he would have a visitor. I did not anticipate that there would be complications. When I heard voices in the corridor and realized that someone had arrived, I was afraid. I went to the study door to observe what was occurring, to understand the nature of this unexpected intrusion. That is when I saw her, Margaret, though I did not know her name at that moment. I saw the scarlet cloak, and I saw Humphrey's expression as he spoke to her. He was smiling, Lord Peter. He was actually smiling at this stranger, in a manner I had not seen directed toward me in years. The psychological deterioration implied by this observation was substantial. Mrs. Hartley's narrative suggested a woman whose sense of self had become so thoroughly enmeshed with her relationship to Humphrey Ashford that the prospect of that relationship's transformation had threatened her with psychological annihilation. She had murdered not to secure inheritance or to satisfy conscious greed, but rather to prevent the extinction of the identity she had constructed over 15 years of secrecy and emotional dependence. The fact that Ashford had been poisoned while preparing tea for his daughter, while, in other words, attempting to effect a reconciliation that Mrs. Hartley perceived as abandonment, had transformed the crime from a calculated act of financial gain into something far more disturbing, a psychological collapse masquerading as premeditation. I did not intend to harm Margaret, Mrs. Hartley continued, her voice acquiring a quality of despair, to defensiveness. I did not know who she was. I thought perhaps she was merely a visitor, a client of some sort. I stood in the hallway, and when I heard them speaking together, When I heard Humphrey's voice soften and become intimate in a manner I had believed was reserved for my own ears alone, something within me fractured. It was at that moment I fully comprehended that my presence at Thornfield was to be terminated, that I was to be displaced and discarded like worn furniture. The poison I had administered was not revenge against Margaret, but against Humphrey, against the man who had promised me security and then withdrawn that promise in favor of satisfying his conscience. Inspector Graves appeared profoundly shaken by this revelation, his expression acquiring the troubled quality of a man confronting the psychological complexities that lay beneath even the most apparently straightforward of criminal acts. Mrs. Hartley's confession was damning, comprehensive, and appeared to emanate from a place of genuine if distorted honesty. She had murdered her lover not in the heat of passion, but through the accumulation of resentments and psychological dependencies that had rendered her capable of viewing his death as preferable to his continued existence in a transformed relationship. The crime was simultaneously premeditated and fundamentally irrational, calculated and deeply emotional. It was, in other words, precisely the sort of crime that revealed the profound distances that could exist between rational motivation and psychological necessity. The formal arrest of Mrs. Hartley proceeded with a minimum of drama or resistance. She submitted to the authority of Inspector Graves with a passivity that suggested relief rather than defiance, as though the exposure of her crime represented the conclusion of a prolonged period of psychological strain that had rendered conceal meant more burdensome than confession. She was conveyed to the county jail with the bearing of a woman who had already commenced the process of accommodating herself to a new and drastically altered existence. Wimsey, observing this procession with the detachment that had characterized his investigation from its inception, felt the peculiar hollowness that invariably accompanied the resolution of cases wherein the culprit was not a villain of theatrical proportions, but merely an ordinary individual whose circumstances and psychological vulnerabilities had conspired to produce an act of extraordinary violence. The investigation itself appeared to be concluded, yet Wimsey recognized that certain aspects of the case remained insufficiently illuminated, questions of motivation and psychological nuance that the formal machinery of justice would likely overlook in favor of the simpler narratives required for prosecution and conviction. His return to London was undertaken with the intention of conducting several final inquiries regarding the broader context within which the crime had occurred. The solicitor, Edmund Parkhouse, proved cooperative in providing information regarding the disposition of Humphrey Ashford's estate and the nature of the arrangements he had intended to make for Margaret's benefit. The will revealed an estate of considerable value, approximately £130,000, the majority of which had been intended to pass to Charles Ashford, though with substantial provisions established for Margaret in the form of a trust that would provide her with an annual income of approximately £3,000, sufficient to guarantee her financial independence and social respectability. This bequest, Parkhouse explained with evident gravity, had occasioned considerable correspondence with Charles Ashford's solicitor, who had threatened legal challenge to the will on the grounds of undue influence, or the possibility that Ashford had not been of sound mind when executing the document. Such challenges, Parkhouse indicated, would likely have been unsuccessful but would have generated considerable expense and public scandal. Wimsey observed that Mrs. Hartley's crime had effectively resolved this legal complication by ensuring that Ashford died intestate regarding the new provisions, with his estate reverting to the original will, wherein Charles Ashford remained the principal beneficiary. Whether Mrs. Hartley had fully appreciated this consequence of her actions remained uncertain, but the effect had been to ensure that the murder she had committed accomplished precisely what Charles Ashford might have paid handsomely to achieve through legal proceedings. The matter of Margaret Ashford required attention of a considerably more delicate variety. Wimsey journeyed to Manchester with the intention of conducting a final interview with the young woman, now freed from the immediate suspicion that had driven her to flight, but nonetheless shattered by the revelation of the circumstances surrounding her father's death. She received him in her hotel room with the bearing of someone who had aged considerably in the brief interval since their previous meeting. The knowledge that her father had died at the precise moment he was extending the hand of reconciliation, and that he had died as a consequence of his attempt to rectify past wrongs, appeared to have inflicted upon her a psychological wound far deeper than the initial abandonment she had endured. "He was attempting to protect me," she said quietly, her gaze fixed upon some point beyond the confines of the hotel room. "When he made the will, when he ensured that I would be provided for in perpetuity, he was attempting to ensure that I would never suffer the deprivation my M.O. Thur endured, and Mrs. Hartley murdered him for precisely that act of conscience." Whimsy settled into the chair across from her, his expression acquiring that particular gentleness that emerged when he was confronted with the suffering of the innocent. "You understand, I trust, that Mrs. Hartley's crime was born of psychological necessity rather than rational malice. She had constructed an identity entirely dependent upon her relationship with your father, and she perceived your arrival as the destruction of that identity. She was, in a very real sense, defending herself against annihilation." Margaret's response suggested a young woman struggling to reconcile compassion with the fundamental injustice of the situation. "I cannot forgive her," she said finally, "but neither can I hate her with the intensity that perhaps I should. She was trapped, as I have been trapped, by the consequences of my father's selfishness. We are both victims of his inability to face the consequences of his own actions until it was far too late to repair the damage without creating new tragedies." This observation struck Whimsy as possessed of a maturity and psychological penetration that suggested Margaret had inherited considerable intellectual capacity from the man whose recognition she had so briefly possessed before his death. The question of financial provision for Margaret required resolution of a practical nature. Whimsy arranged, through his considerable connections, and with the assistance of Edmund Parkhouse, for the establishment of a trust that would provide Margaret with an annual income of £2,000, less than the amount Humphrey Ashford had intended, but sufficient to guarantee her financial independence and, more importantly, sufficient to provide her with the freedom to construct an identity independent of either her father's legacy or the trauma of his death. Ranged further for her introduction to certain respectable families of his acquaintance who might provide her with social connections and the opportunity to establish herself within London society as a woman of independent means rather than as the illegitimate offspring of a murdered man. Whether such arrangements would ultimately prove satisfactory remained, as with all human matters of significance, subject to the vagaries of circumstance and individual choice. Yet Whimsy departed Manchester with the conviction that he had accomplished what practical assistance could provide, and that Margaret Ashford possessed the intellectual and emotional resources necessary to construct a tolerable existence from the ruins of her father's belated redemption. The final matter requiring attention was of a considerably more philosophical character. Whimsy returned to Thornfield Manor to conduct a final examination of the study, the site wherein the crime had been perpetrated, and wherein, he suspected, certain details remained insufficiently appreciated. The rose garden, viewed in the declining light of late afternoon, appeared to possess a quality of melancholy beauty that seemed appropriate to the events that had transpired within the boundaries of the estate. Whimsy stood for a considerable interval observing the skeletal remains of the plants, the pruned branches and enriched soil that bore testimony to years of obsessive cultivation. He understood, with the clarity that often emerged at the conclusion of investigations, that Humphrey Ashford's roses represented something far more significant than mere horticultural achievement. They represented the accumulation of care and attention directed toward the creation of beauty in a life otherwise characterized by isolation, deception, and the systematic avoidance of moral responsibility. Mrs. Hartley had tended those roses alongside. Her employer had participated in his obsessive cultivation, had believed that the shared labor constituted a form of intimacy that transcended the boundaries of their formal relationship. The destruction of that relationship had destroyed not merely her emotional security, but the very meaning she had attributed to years of devoted service. The trial of Mrs. Hartley occurred in the spring of the following year, conducted with the procedural formality that English law demanded and observed, by a public gallery that displayed considerably more interest in the scandal of Humphrey Ashford's long-standing illicit relationship than in the legal niceties of the poisoning itself. The prosecution presented its case with methodical precision, establishing timeline, motive, and means through the testimony of chemists, servants, and railway officials. Mrs. Hartley's counsel, recognizing the futility of denying the crime, pursued instead a defense based upon diminished capacity and psychological duress, arguments that possessed considerable merit given the circumstances, but which were ultimately insufficient to overcome the fundamental fact of premeditation evidenced by the procurement and dissolution of cyanide prior to the evening of the murder. The jury, composed of 12 men possessed of that peculiar combination of moral certitude and practical pragmatism that characterized the English middle classes, deliberated for approximately 2 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty. Mrs. Hartley received this pronouncement with an expression of profound resignation, as though the verdict represented not a surprise but merely the inevitable conclusion of a narrative that had been predetermined long before the actual administration of poison. The sentence of death by hanging was delivered with the solemnity appropriate to capital crimes, and Wimsey, observing the proceedings, fro. The gallery, with an expression of carefully maintained detachment, felt the familiar weight of melancholy that accompanied the intersection of justice and tragedy. Yet it was in the days subsequent to the trial's conclusion that the true significance of the case revealed itself to Wimsey with a clarity that had been absent during the investigation itself. He received a letter from Margaret Ashford, written from a cottage in Sussex where she had established herself with the income that had been secured through the trust arrangements. The letter contained no accusations and no expressions of gratitude, but rather a series of observations regarding the nature of her father's crime and the psychological circumstances that had produced it. Margaret had been engaged in reading the psychological literature that was increasingly becoming available in the post-war period, works by Jung and Adler that addressed the unconscious sources of human behavior. She had arrived at the conclusion that her father's crime, viewed from a certain perspective, was not fundamentally an act of malice, but rather an act of self-preservation on the part of a woman whose entire identity had been constructed around the role she occupied in another's life. This observation, while not exculpating Mrs. Hartley, provided a context within which her actions could be understood as something more complex than mere villainy. "I have come to believe," Margaret wrote, "that my father's greatest crime was not his abandonment of my mother or his refusal of acknowledgement of my existence, but rather his creation of a relationship with Mrs. Hartley that was predicated upon secrecy and dependence. He offered her security but denied her dignity. He offered her intimacy but denied her identity. When I arrived at Thornfield, I represented not merely a threat to her financial security, but a threat to the very meaning she had attributed to her existence. In this sense, perhaps we are all culpable. My father for his selfishness, Mrs. Hartley for her violence, and I for the circumstances of my birth that precipitated the tragedy." Wimsey, reading this letter in his study in Piccadilly, recognized within Margaret's analysis a penetration of psychological nuance that transcended the conventional boundaries of legal culpability. She had grasped, with an insight that many professional psychologists might have failed to achieve, the fundamental truth that Mrs. Hartley's crime was not born of simple malevolence, but rather of a psychological catastrophe produced by the collision of competing human needs and emotional dependencies. Mrs. Hartley had murdered not because she was inherently evil, but because she had been placed in a position wherein her psychological survival appeared to require the destruction of her lover. The tragedy lay not in the fact of her crime, but in the fact that the circumstances that had produced the crime were not aberrations but rather logical extensions of the psychological arrangements that pervaded ordinary human existence. Wimsey found himself contemplating whether society bore some measure of responsibility for the circumstances that had produced the tragedy, whether the conventions that rendered relationships like that between Humphrey Ashford and Mrs. Hartley necessarily secret and dependent had not themselves contributed to the psychological distortion that had culminated in murder. These reflections occupied Wimsey's mind for some considerable time subsequent to the trial's conclusion, and they manifested themselves in a marked disinclination toward the investigations that had previously occupied much of his time. Inspector Graves, encountering him at the Athenaeum Club approximately 3 months after Mrs. Hartley's conviction, observed that the Baronet AP appeared somewhat worn and preoccupied. When Graves inquired regarding Whimsy's current activities, the response was characteristically oblique. "I have been contemplating," Whimsy explained, lighting a cigarette with deliberate precision, the curious paradox whereby the investigation of crime appears to illuminate the functioning of human society in a manner that the observation of ordinary life scarcely permits. We detect murders, we identify culprits, we see justice administered, and yet we are left with the uncomfortable awareness that justice, in its conventional form, addresses only the most superficial aspects of the psychological tragedies that produce violent crime. Mrs. Hartley will hang for the poisoning of Humphrey Ashford, but the circumstances that rendered her capable of committing that poisoning will continue to generate similar tragedies in other households, other relationships, other circumstances of psychological dependence and emotional isolation. Graves appeared to struggle somewhat with the philosophical implications of this observation. "Surely, Lord Peter, the administration of justice must proceed according to law rather than psychological theory? We cannot permit murderers to escape accountability merely because we recognize psychological factors contributing to their crimes." Whimsy nodded with apparent agreement. "Quite right, quite right. Justice must indeed proceed according to established legal principles. Yet one might question whether the law itself is adequately equipped to address the psychological realities it purports to govern. But I digress. These are questions for philosophers rather than detective investigators, I fear." With that, Whimsy rose from his chair and departed the club, leaving Inspector Graves with the impression of a man who had confronted truths of sufficient profundity to render the conventional satisfactions of deep detective work considerably less compelling than they had previously appeared. The case of Humphrey Ashford's murder achieved, in the fullness of time, the status of a minor historical curiosity, a footnote in the annals of English criminal investigation, referred to occasionally in academic discussions of poisoning cases or in the memoirs of those who had been tangentially involved in its investigation. Yet for Whimsy himself, the investigation represented something of greater significance. It marked the moment at which he had begun to perceive the limitations of detective work as a method of achieving justice or understanding human motivation. The resolution of the case had been logically satisfying but psychologically unsettling, leaving in its wake a series of questions regarding the nature of culpability, the relationship between intention and circumstance, and the degree to which law could address the fundamental human tragedies that produced criminal acts. These questions would occupy his thinking for some considerable time thereafter, and they would contribute substantially to the increasing ambivalence with which he would regard the detective profession in the years to come. For the present, however, he departed Thornfield Manor with the conviction that the case had been adequately resolved through the machinery of justice, even if that resolution felt somehow incomplete in regard to the deeper truths it had revealed regarding the psychological vulnerabilities that rendered ordinary people capable of extraordinary violence.